This is the In Good Time podcast with Nick Lowe and Andrew Steininger. In this episode, we take a reflective look at our previous school year. We draw from personal experiences, stories, and events with our students, and thoughts that we have developed throughout the year to make changes or improvements for the future. We take note of some of the struggles teaching and adapting during COVID brought, as well as some of the potential improvements to our teaching. Welcome back to another episode of the In Good Time podcast with Nick and I. This time, we thought we would do something a little bit different and have it be a little less formal with much less of a topic, more of just a recap of our years as music educators. Me being my first year in a new job and Nick being his second year, but most importantly, the year of COVID. Where we had a full year of COVID type situation going on. So, Nick, how'd your year go?
You know, all things considered, it went fairly well. I was really surprised comparing this year's kids to last year's kids. I felt like last year, so it was my first year teaching, the ability levels, you had some really good kids, some kids that were really struggling, but a lot more people were kind of in that middle, just an average fifth grade person. Whereas I feel like this year it was very, very polar, where some kids, I think because they had less to do, and, everybody who's into music knows that it's such a good kind of escape from, whatever you're going through, that some of the kids this year, were totally outpacing my kids from last year within the first couple months of playing, and then you had the other extreme where, at the end of this year, I still could not get one of my flute groups to practice enough at home to be able to play B flat, C, D, E flat, F. They just could not do that, even at the end of the year. So it's kind of crazy to see that. There's a word for that. Stratified, is that? No.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, so. I definitely hear that. And I see that, even more because I've got elementary, middle school, and high school. And right. What's interesting is the students, I hate to sound so definitive or deterministic, but the students that kind of front load a little bit when they're in elementary school, when they learn those first 5 notes and they know them really well, they do fairly well once they get to middle school and high school because they've got those skills that they already know versus the kids that are kind of catching up. Eventually they are able to play the music that they've got going on, but their mind is not necessarily looking forward at, what they're maybe enjoying or what they can do better or those things. They're thinking backward at the stuff that they have to learn that their peers are already doing.
Yeah, I talked about that a lot with my colleagues this year. Is how important that fundamental level is, and it's kind of eye-opening to now be in that role because, going through college and whatnot, it's very high school focused and that's where the greatest music happens. And then having taught 2 years at fifth grade, it's wow, I can really tell that I have to make sure I'm doing a good job because everything that they know is coming from what I'm teaching them. So there's a little bit of pressure to do a good job, but it's, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. And I think it's a misconception that you can't make music at every level. It's just a different kind of music, some of my greatest moments teaching this year actually came from elementary school, just because for example, I have both of my clarinet groups that I had consistently, I don't know if they practiced or not, but consistently played well in their lessons and were excited to learn. And so I had some really great moments with them where by the end, I was having them play a concert B flat major scale, or maybe it was a concert A flat major scale. And I would just play 1, 4, 5, 1 on the piano, and while they were playing the notes, and they had a blast doing it. And in that time, they were like, "Oh, can we try that again? I messed that up. Oh, I think I messed up on that note. Can we try that again?" Without me being, having to be the taskmaster and say, "Okay, we did okay, but we didn't do so well on the whatever note that's in there." And that to me is a really rewarding experience.
Yeah, one of my, I think, favorite lessons that I did this past year was when we got back to in-person lessons. So we went back and forth between remote, and then we had like a week of hybrid, and then we were back remote. January, we started hybrid, but I was still doing all Zoom lessons until right after spring break. So I really only had, or maybe right before spring break. So I only ended up having like 10 or 11 weeks with the kids in person. So when we got back, I knew that playing together and keeping an accurate pulse, like a steady tempo, was going to be really hard for them. And so we opened up to the Winning Rhythms book that I had them use. We went back to like the first couple pages, and we were like playing through the rhythms. And, with the groups that were struggling, we would all play unison. But for my more advanced groups that like playing together was a challenge, but individually they were doing okay. We just did different chords. And I had a flute group where I said, all right, let's get really complicated. And so I said, you play this note, you play this note. And we did an F7 chord for the first 2 measures, and then I had them resolve it to a B flat chord. And we just played that, and it was just so much fun, and the kids loved it. And it was like, all we were doing is working on rhythms, but it was playing it like they had never played together before. And so it was like eye-opening. Whoa, this is so cool.
I think something that I realized with particularly the younger students, like middle school and elementary school, but this applies to high school too. Sometimes it seems like we as teachers are afraid to give our students stuff that might be over their head. Like the kids don't know what an F7 chord is, and you're not going to take the time to explain, okay, you've got a major third, a minor third, and then another minor third right on top of that. They don't need to know that. But having them play it is not hard to do. So just engaging students with that, to me, is a really valuable tool. Like my beginners, for example, just having them play harmony, like not necessarily right from the beginning, but close to the beginning, having them play harmony, just in something in thirds, or just holding a note and playing a fifth with another student on clarinet. That's really easy to do. If you start doing that early, they're just developing their ears early. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? You're not expecting a beginner to play a perfectly in tune fifth. Sometimes you can't even expect high schoolers to do that, although you should. But yeah, so something that I've learned is throw as much as you can at those kids and allow them to respond to it, because that's the only way you'll really know if they're able to learn that stuff. And if they're, if you can see that they're struggling with it, then you take some steps and go from there.
Right. Yeah, I've got, so I also teach private lessons, and a lot of the private lessons that I teach are beginning piano. And so actually the just coming from one of those lessons, it's an 8-year-old piano student, and she is in love with Beethoven. Like, surprisingly, like everything is like, oh, Beethoven, wait. And every kid wants to learn Für Elise, but she's like, Mr. Lowe, can we do Moonlight Sonata? And I'm like, ooh, okay. And so in the series of books that I use, like, there's a version of it it's short and it's easier, but it's like 3 books beyond where she's at. And so we photocopied it, and we've been going, we spend like, she does an hour-long lesson every week, and we spend like 15 minutes on it, going like, measure by measure, triplet by triplet, and it's a lot of her learning it by rote. But it's so cool to see, like, I was like, okay, this measure, the triplet pattern switches every beat. This is going to be hard. And, like, I didn't tell her that. But I just said, here's how it goes. And she was like, oh, like this? And then she plays it, and I'm like, well, darn tootin'. Yep, that's how it goes.
Well, it's really funny how intuitive sound is for kids, especially kids. Like adults, when you talk to adults, they're like, I can't do music at all. I can't hear anything. I don't know, any of that stuff. But when you talk to a kid and you give them something that most trained musicians or educated students in music would say is relatively complicated, they can do it usually by rote. Like, for example, when I was working with an elementary percussionist, play this rhythm back to me. I'd throw in quarter notes, eighth notes. Sometimes you do 16th notes, and every so often I'd have fun and I'd throw in some triplets. And if you don't say anything to them and add like this verbal, like understand what I'm saying and what you're hearing at the same time,
right?
Usually they're okay with it. It's obviously they're still elementary schoolers or middle schoolers, so they're not going to be perfect at it.
Right.
But they get the idea. They get the sound.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see different learning styles come into play. Like I had one percussion student this year, and he was actually he stayed remote all year, so I never met him in person. But he was much better at the reading portion of it than he was necessarily like the listening portion. Because like I can play something and he'd kind of be able to match it, but if I showed him a rhythm, quarter note and basic eighth note patterns, he was able to always sight read it. Whoa, like flipping around my chord there. He was like always able to sight read it, which is really cool. And then you've got other students that are the opposite, where they have no idea what's going on visually, but aurally, like you play it for them and they just play it right back. And it's kind of cool to see.
That's been one of my big like brain teasers, I guess you could call it. One of my big brainstorming things just starting this summer and even throughout the year is what strategies can I use and what lessons can I plan, what activities can we do that's going to connect those things. So like in music, there's so many different skills happening simultaneously. Right. You can name a number of them: physical, motor skills, aural skills, decoding skills, right? Being able to translate symbols on a page. All those things are happening simultaneously. So how can we take what students are naturally strong at, which I would usually include aural skills in that. It seems like kids are pretty good, generally speaking, at aural skills. And how do you translate that into one of the harder skills, which is sometimes symbolic interpretation, right? How do you, because you're basically teaching kids how to read.
Right.
You're teaching them a new language in the symbols of music. So how do you take, okay, this is what, this is your open G on clarinet. This is what it looks like on a piece of music. Now, when you see this, you have to play it at this time and in this place. Right. Like how do we bridge that gap together?
Yeah, it is kind of tricky. Especially for string players, because they're doing like fine motor skills and gross motor skills, whereas in addition to all those other things, whereas like for example brass, it's all fine motor skills, and so the more I learn about playing and teaching strings, the more I realize it's a physically involved instrument. Like there's so much like body movement technique that's involved. Like there's like, you might not remember back from string tech, but like there's bilateral versus unilateral movement, and like where it's like unilateral is you move the same direction, bilateral you're going the opposite, and it's like it's so cool, especially when you obviously I'm not teaching that explicitly to, my fifth graders. But it's like it helps kind of connect to the music, especially when you see a kid, they're like playing and they're moving on their own. It's like, you.
Yeah,
That's nice.
that's actually something another thing that I'm planning on really hammering next year, both at all levels, is the internalization of both pulse and rhythm. You could put in the same category, and aural skills, so harmonic understanding. Because what I've realized is, when we grew up, you and I, we grew up in a very, very fast-paced learning environment. So right from the beginning, in both of our schooling and all of our schooling, we're going from point A to point B to point C, and we're just on the pipeline, and that obviously has served us well. But at least in my situation, in a community where music is not really a priority, nor is it something, the level of complexity that and the knowledge that I have about music is not really present in the community at large. That pacing sometimes can be a deterrent for students to become involved in the program. So what I'm picking up is that in order to teach those skills in a way that's going to produce students that are able to replicate them, I think I need to make a more committed effort to making them a daily practice. So for example, at next year, what I'm planning to do, I think at all levels, but in particular my high school, because students can actually, or at least what I've observed, students in my district, and I'm sure this is true of other places, can make it to high school based mostly on aural, being able to hear things and then just play it, and they can do relatively well up until about a certain point in high school. And then once you start playing harder music, and you don't hear that type of sound as often, then they struggle a little bit, because their ability to interpret notes and interpret rhythms just isn't, the written rhythms there. So including things in a warm-up, like, okay, we're doing daily rhythm practice, or we're going to do, every other day we're going to do some type of rhythm practice. And that's going to be maybe a weekly assignment. And then every other day that isn't those days, we're going to do some type of harmonic practice that is included in like a scale type of practice, where we're learning a scale every other week, and we're also going to do some harmonic exercises while we practice that scale. So you're just kind of blending all those skills together. And then the cool thing about that is, I'm not necessarily looking to beat the kids down with it, where it's like a final assessment and you have to play for me this scale sheet. Rather make it a daily practice so that we're getting the skills that we need, but it's still something that I know is going to produce a habit in them, because that's what we want to do as a musician. When we learn these basics, we want to produce a good habit that we're going to do automatically, rather than having to think about, okay, this is my A flat scale, or this is my whatever scale.
Right. Yeah. One of the so I love using the Winning Rhythms book, and I mean, normally the last 2 years I really haven't gotten beyond like number 4, so like page 5 or something. For some reason the book starts on page 2 instead of page 1. But those first 4 are so good. I didn't really do it this year just because it was going to be a little difficult to include it in over Zoom in the way I wanted to. But last year what I did was, at the start of pretty much every lesson, we would just go through 2 lines. We'd like do 1 line from last week and then do the next line, and we would just quick count and clap it, play it, and then move on to the next part of our warm up. And it was pretty good, because like by the end, or not even by the end, but like after a couple months of working and doing that, the kids were kind of able to start themselves, and like they were starting to get an internal pulse, so they could kind of keep track. And so that's something that I'm really looking forward to doing again next year. I think one of the things I'm also looking to do that I haven't done enough yet is like foot tapping. Because like my first year, I was just so, overwhelmed with, okay, I have to do X, Y, and Z, like, and I have to make sure that I completely just didn't even think about it. This year, I couldn't do it because teaching it over Zoom, it's like, okay, I do not want to see your feet on the camera. Like,
right.
No. So next year, I think I'm gonna really stress that, because I've been able to tell, like, the students who naturally do it definitely have a better sense of pulse and rhythm. Mm-hmm. That I think it's super valuable. I also really want to touch on intonation more next year, because that's something, again, this year, especially over Zoom, you know, I can barely tell what note you're playing sometimes, let alone if it's in tune. And so, like, yeah, because, like, I mean, again, I only do 5th grade, but they can understand tuning. Like, you know, they're not going to get it perfect, but it sounds nice when the kids are in tune. So
well, you actually said something while we were still in college that I actually used to explain to the kids, and I'd never explained tuning like this before, but the idea of you want to sound the exact same as the person next to you, or you want it to sound like one instrument, right? And that's a really easy thing for kids to understand. You know, like, because you're not going to expect an elementary student to be perfectly in tune, but they can get pretty wide in the interpretation of the tuning. And obviously that's me being generous with what I'm saying. But they understand that it doesn't sound like the same note. Most of them. Sometimes you'll have students that have a hard time hearing these things. But when I find that the young students are able to handle more if you let them. You know, like, if you tell them, okay, we have to do this, and you give them a little bit of a process to do it, they're like, okay, yeah. And then if you ask them, hey, what do you think's going wrong in our process? They want to figure it out, generally speaking.
I think it's always so funny, because some things the younger students, like we were just saying, you give them an inch and they'll, like, run with the concept. But then, like, other things, no matter how many times you say it, they have no idea how to do it. Like, and it's all, I always find that it comes back to note reading. Like, they have been reading notes all through general music, and then they get to me, and we reinforce it. And, you know, at the beginning of the year, it's like, what, 3 notes, and they still, like, decoding what it is. And then, like, they can tell me the fingering, but, like, just looking at it is just such a big, like,
yeah.
And then it, like, and the specific part of that they, like, can't apply to is looking through a new piece of music. So I always tell the kids, every single time we learn something, we do the same method so that they understand how to tackle a piece themselves. I take 2 measures, count and clap the rhythm, okay? Do the fingering and say the letters, okay? Count and clap the rhythm and say the letters. Say the letters, move your fingers, and then play it. And it's like, you know, multiple months in, and I say, how might we start learning this? And they're like, I have no idea. I'm like, guys, we've been doing the same thing.
Yeah, one of my favorite techniques, because what we're talking about really, and this is something that advanced musicians will talk about, is it's pattern recognition, right? And especially those young beginner pieces, realistically, there's really only 2 or 3 patterns in a piece of music that they really have to learn. There's a whole ton of repetition in the early band and early orchestra pieces. So one of my favorite phrases to say to students is, where have you seen this before? You know, like, we're going through a piece of music, and I want them to say, oh, I played that over here. And I'm like, so is measure 16 through measure 24, is that the same as somewhere else? And they're like, no. And I'm like, why don't you take a look? And I'm like, they're like, oh, that's the same as the beginning. And I'm like,
Yep.
Fancy how that works.
Yeah. Or the other question that I ask is, okay, in this measure, is the rhythm the same or different, not the notes, the rhythm. And it's the same thing, but down a step. And they're like, oh, no, it's totally different. Well, what's different about it? Well, the notes are different. Guys, I just said it's not the notes, just the rhythm.
Yeah. Yeah, and that those moments are great, except when they have those moments multiple weeks in a row on the same thing.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that that I've learned from teaching so many beginning piano lessons is that those students, one of the patterns that it's just easier to do on piano is learning steps versus skips, because all the stuff that we do is finger, 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 finger. So a step, you go from one finger to the next finger, and a skip, you go literally skip a finger. And it took me a while to figure that out, but once I've started using that to reinforce note and rhythm and pattern recognition, the students are getting it a lot faster. That was more of a recent thing, so I haven't figured out if or how I want to incorporate that into band / orchestra.
Yeah.
Especially for, I could see the strings using it, because if it's a step, you step. If it's a skip, you skip. But that doesn't work for the cello per se, because you'd be skipping a finger. But there's got to be a way. I mean, even just the pattern recognition. I've figured it out. Yeah.
I really do believe in the 5-note pattern kind of sequence of learning things. So getting young students and middle schoolers, you can do a lot of notes with middle schoolers. But having them learn those 5 notes really well, and you can make it a game, right? Okay, we're going to learn these 5 notes in class today. And then by the end of class, they're able to play them all in a row, right? Usually that's not a huge feat to accomplish if you can just get a student to play 5 notes in a row. But then, you send them home and I say, okay, next time I'm going to hear you play those notes for me, but I want you to play them as fast as you possibly can, but they have to be right. And then that becomes fun for them, because they're like, I don't want to play these notes slow. That's boring, Mr. S. But if you say, okay, I give you permission to play these as fast as you can, now you're giving them something that's fun. And people will talk about with elementary kids that you don't want to build bad habits with them, which is true. You want to be giving them good information and not having them build bad habits. But there's some room in there where you can give them a task that may lead to a bad habit, but since you're asking them to do it and you're going to be correcting them on it, I think it's okay to ask them to do things like that. Some people will say, okay, no, don't teach them this until this time, or don't do this with them until this time. And I can understand where that would come from. But as long as you're double checking on the fundamentals at a consistent time period with them, you're not just leaving them alone and allowing, the weeds of bad habits to grow, right? I think they're okay, because like we said before, you give them an inch and they go a mile. If you give them something that's super cool to them, they love it and they'll learn it, and they'll have a ton of fun. Speaking more to that skip thing, the steps and skips thing, at least because I only teach band, but getting those students used to that 5-note pattern, and then addressing, usually when you talk about thirds with a student, that's kind of a more advanced scale exercise. Usually when you learn thirds in as a more advanced student, that's kind of typically a harder exercise than just playing a scale. But I think you can modulate that 5-note pattern and have them start doing thirds or stuff like that. Or have them, obviously fourths is not really possible with only 5 notes, but incorporate, you take the activities that you would do on a full scale and put it in that 5-note scale pattern. And that way the kids are already working on understanding what that sounds like and some of the finger movement that might be necessary to do with those things. And then when
Yeah.
they get to that next point, where you're doing it on a whole scale, or you're going from doing patterns and thirds and then playing a scale and then, whatever, like it would be in a piece of music, they at least have some experience with that type of information.
Yeah, that's a good idea. There's a lot of those activities that, yeah, you can definitely do with like that pattern. For your older kids, have you started looking based on what they did this year? Have you started looking at repertoire for next year?
It's explicit, like not explicit, but specifically looking at repertoire, like real seriously, no. But I definitely have a better vision of what I can and or can't do with them. So,
Yeah.
for example, this past year was basically a litmus test year for me and those kids. So, the beginning of the year, I probably underprogrammed them a little bit. And by the end of the year, I may have actually given them a little bit too much music.
I did that same thing my first year. Yeah.
But what it did teach me, though, is that the kids want to play interesting music. It's just a matter of, okay, how much interesting music can we play? And interesting and hard aren't always like connected.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
often they perceive it that way. So like a piece that's got slow rhythms and like some of the really beautiful slow pieces, most of the time the kids don't really like those.
Right.
But finding that balance, and all directors have talked about this from the beginning of band, is finding that balance between what is challenging for students but also what's going to produce a good concert, right? What the kids are actually able to turn into good music. And then something else that I learned, this is a fun something that I did. So we had finals week because we were all in person the whole year, and during finals week, all the other classes, we weren't I don't think we didn't give like any graded finals for any of classes, just due to our policy surrounding COVID.
Sure.
But I did an activity with them where we listened to all of our recordings from the year and we talked about it. And I knew that this was going to happen, where I was, by the end of the period, some of the kids are going to be like, oh, why are we listening to all of our recordings? But what was really interesting, and I didn't necessarily anticipate this, but at least in my community, the kids are pretty critical of themselves. They weren't really willing to admit the places where they got better. So, for example, we did warm-ups every day at the high school level, and my high school band is 12 kids, so did not an extensive warm-up, but we
Right.
we tuned unison notes, and then we tuned chords, and I noticed they got progressively better at not only the speed at which they were able to get in tune, but the quality of the chord itself. What's the word? It rang more, basically.
Sure.
It was better balanced, and that reflected in their music that they played. They were able to, not, I don't know if it was conscious, but the music, the recordings, some of the harmonies started to sound better as we went along, and it took me pointing those things out to them for them to admit that they did sound better at the end of the year than they did at the beginning of the year. Because what I noticed was when you play a piece of music for kids, they're evaluating it based off of this ideal in their head, right? Oh, that didn't sound good at all. I'm
Right.
like, okay, maybe it didn't sound the best, but did it sound better than the piece that we just played, or did it sound better than the piece? And showing kids that you have to take an incremental approach to these things. Otherwise, if you're using the CSO as a point of comparison, there's no hope for you, right?
Right.
Yeah. There's all your music sounds bad compared to the CSO.
Yeah. Yeah, I did a virtual concert for both of my ensembles, and we just did one piece each because that's all they were able to handle this year. But it was very funny because, once I was finished with the editing process, I had all the groups watch it, and it was so funny to see some of the kids go like, "This is the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life," and it's just like, "Yeah, okay, man." And then other kids, like, they hear the first couple notes and they're like, "Mr. Lowe, why do we sound so horrible?" And I always give the same response. I'm like, you know what? Here's a secret. Everyone sounds horrible in 5th grade, but this is a really good foundation. Like, you guys are going to sound better the longer that you play and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But it's just so funny because, like, like, some of the kids are like wide-eyed, like, I have never heard anything this gorgeous. And it's like, well, you got a lot to learn.
I think we actually have a relatively difficult job and most music people know this, but the success in our craft, right? The success is being able to play music, and maybe not all students are interested in playing music. Maybe they just want to be a part of it. But I think most of us that are teaching performing ensembles, there is a part of us that wants to have the students play well, and we want them to know that they played well. But the problem is that most students aren't really thinking about that incremental approach to learning and the incremental approach to playing music. They're thinking about what they hear on the radio, right? And what they hear on the radio is always sounds good because it's produced in a studio. And what we are doing is much harder to do, to produce things that sound good to the ear. And mostly because we're not, in pop culture, we're not hearing the sounds that you make in band or orchestra anymore. Right. You don't hear those sounds really at all. But it's the combination of those two things where students are very momentary thinkers, right? They're not really thinking too far in the future, and obviously that comes with age. Right. But when you're learning and teaching music, having that perspective really is important, because otherwise you think you sound bad forever.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I have found that so long term, I'd like to be at a middle school, but I have found that I really do enjoy 5th grade more than I thought I would, because the amount of progress that the kids do is, I mean, they start from not knowing how to even open their case to, at the end of the year, they're able to play a scale or two. They're, performing a concert, and they've got all this, and it's like, there's so much growth that happens that, like, if you point it out to the kids, they're like, oh yeah, that is kind of cool. Like, like, by the time we get to the spring, like, I'm always telling the kids, hey, like, especially when they're having trouble with something, like, hey, do you remember back to the first week when we didn't know how to put our shoulder rest on? And the kids are like, oh, that's so easy now. It's like, yeah, it's like we practiced that, and now we're at the next step. So,
one of my favorite strategies with the young kids is when I give them the opportunity to teach me, and it's so much fun to kind of, when they are excited to tell me the information that they've learned. And what's cool about that is you can direct that. So, like, okay, how do you play this? How do you play this measure? And they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this and this. And then they say something that's not quite right. And you're like, well, what if you did that, what would happen? Or, like, how would you get to the next note if you did that? And they're like, oh, okay, wait a second, that's not it. And it's very rewarding to see the process in their little brains. You love to hear them play good, and you love to hear them, do what you told them to do. But for me, it's more important that I can see them thinking about it. And one of the things that I've been asked a couple times about, how do you know when, like, your culture is working in the classroom, or how do you know when your students are engaged or being responsive? And for me, it's really, really simple. I don't think it has to be complicated at all. If your students are talking to each other or to themselves about anything that's happening in your classroom. The content, something that another student did while you were addressing some content, they're engaged. They're thinking and talking about what's going on in the classroom, and that's engagement. Now, you obviously have to tweak that a little bit because, middle schooler or elementary schooler picks their nose, and that's the conversation that happens in the classroom. That's not really what you want going on. But like, if you have a student that's like, oh, John, that's not the right fingering, you've got them, right? Because they're thinking about what they're supposed to be doing, and now they're looking at another student, they're perceiving something, and then they're actually doing the teaching. So when people are talking about, it's really hard to measure student engagement and all that, I don't think it's that hard. I think we might be looking in the wrong place for what student engagement actually is.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever thought about like that. So it's a good,
Because and I hate to rant on this, but I actually don't hate it. I like it. But if you just think about yourself, when you get engaged in something, you're engaged when you can't stop thinking about it, right? When you're not engaged with something, you have to force yourself to think about it. So it's the same thing with kids. If the kids are talking and thinking about things that you did in class, they're at a level of engagement.
Yeah, I think that kind of brought to mind one of my biggest takeaways from my first 2 years of teaching, which I almost mashed together as just one very long year. But I think what I'd like to do is actually slow down the amount of content that I'm pushing to the kids, but go more in depth on it. Because now obviously not like to an extreme amount, but I think one of the things that I've found myself doing is, we need to get through this week. We need to get to X, Y, and Z before, the Thanksgiving break or whatever. But I think what I actually need to do is to go just use more materials that cover the same concept. Because, a lot of times, like, the method books will have, 2 or 3 little tunes that reinforce a skill. But sometimes that's not quite enough. And I think what I'd like to start doing is, okay, let me quick make an exercise for you, or find another method book and give you one of the tunes from there, so that they're doing a lot of music, but they're very focused on whatever skill it is, so that they can, they don't just know it, they understand it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think a good way of potentially assessing that, and this is something that I love to do, is making up exercises on the fly. And I do it with my high schoolers all the time with warm-ups. I'm like, okay, we're going to do, play me this chord. Okay, now let's do it a different way, or you play this note and you play this note, or whatever. And maybe if you'd ask students to potentially do that, you can really see where their heads are at with the understanding of it. Because in order to make something up, you have to know how it functions, and then you have to kind of know where it's going to end up in order to make something that you can actually do.
Right. There's a lot of thought that they have to do if they're doing something like that. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about what COVID was like for us this year. And then I think we'll wrap up after that. Just keep it nice and short. But
sure.
Yeah, COVID year for instrumental ensembles. How was it, Nick?
Oh, it's so dumb. Like, so our district, one of the things that it's not quite good at yet is having a united music front of here's what we need to do as a district. And so like one of our middle schools ordered all of their PPE and they got it. The other middle school chose to not order any PPE and get a giant tent instead. And then the three elementary schools, we came together and we put together a proposal for what we needed supply-wise. But when we don't have a budget at the elementary level this year, so we have to get that to our admins, and the supervisor chose not to rush the product, even though it was like a really quick turnaround from where we found out we were going to be going back to in-person. So we ended up getting the face mask, like the musicians' masks, but the bell covers never came in. And so the entire year that we were in person, I took a bunch of just regular surgical masks and like stapled them together and used like tape over the bells. So it was such a hassle. It took so long. That's, I think, the biggest thing is all this PPE and like the precautionary side, which is very important, but it just took so long to do that by the time we set up, it was already 10-15 minutes into the lesson.
Yeah, that I can echo that frustration, and just the administrative side of making sure that happens. You know, in the band world or the instrumental world, it's already, I don't want to say difficult, but there's already an additional challenge, that a routine that you have to go through every day just to get the students prepared to participate in class. You know, generally speaking, in other classrooms, students can come in and participate in some way depending on what activity you're doing, but there's a necessary component in a performing ensemble type situation where you have to get your instrument set up in a way that's going to be good for the whole group. So there, you have to take care of that routine. And when you add this additional aspect onto it, like we did in COVID, with you have to have distance, you have to have some type of PPE on there. They can only play for a certain amount of time depending on what district you're in. Sometimes people went outside. I tried going outside for a little while with my middle schoolers, and it was just a big mess. So I ended up moving them into our gym. And that worked out a lot better because they could space out, and we still had the PPE. It was funny, the PPE that I used, I actually went out and there were these, what are they called? They're like Tupperware covers with elastic, but they're made of plastic. And actually Barry Hauser put them up on Illinois Band Directors Facebook page. But I went out and bought them, and they're really funny because they're colorful and the kids loved them. They're different sizes, but you could see the air from the instrument blowing up the plastic, and that was kind of cool. But they're not perfect by any means because they're not, a fabric that's necessarily blocking or catching or whatever. But you said it best with the mask stapling and taping. We just kind of had to adapt and overcome a lot of those things, not unlike we usually have to do with scheduling and making things happen. So I did a little bit of remote when I had students choosing to opt to be in remote, but how was remote for you as a music teacher?
Well, I had to make some quick decisions on what was important to me and what was not feasible, which stunk. So things that were important were students showing up, because I can't teach a student if they quit. So when we were on Zoom, I made the choice to spend probably too much time at the beginning of the lesson just talking to every kid individually, because they're small. Like my classes are all small group, and so like 4 to 7 kids, and I know that one of the challenges that the kids were having this year was just connecting to other people, and so I wanted band and orchestra to be a place where they could come and connect over music. But then I had, if we were doing that, we didn't have time for other things, and so it was really difficult to kind of be able to throw some of those things to the side, like especially string tuning. Like if a kid's instrument was out of tune, which they go out of tune very quickly, the parents had to drive it over to the school for me to tune it, because no one knows how to tune it if you're a beginning string student or parent. So we just had to sit there, and I had to listen to each string player, you know, and when they'd play, I'd have to like adjust myself. Okay, this kid is tuned to B instead of D. Okay, and figure out what should that sound like in the other key. Yes, that was correct. Your fingers are in the right spots. It just didn't sound like it. The worst part about teaching remote was definitely the lag, because I couldn't necessarily share my screen and have us do an activity all together with a steady tempo.
Right.
Because I tried to do that, and come to find out the kids are telling me, whoa, wait, Mr. Lowe, it stopped and then was super fast for the end. And so I kind of had to figure out, you know, like with smart music, okay, I have to tell the kids to do this, or this works, let's focus on it in this way. Or like a kid would be playing, and then they'll put down their instrument, and I'm hearing them start the second note going, oh dear. I'm like, I need to understand what the kids sounded like and give them feedback, but I'm not going to hear what they played for another 40 seconds. And now the whole group is just sitting around going. So I was the happiest I'd been in a long time when we got back to in person right away, you know?
Yeah. And I think, I'm going to mimic what you said earlier about just making sure that you're connected to the kids and making sure they feel like they're a part of something.
Right.
To me, that's what education is, really. Like, that's the fundamental basis of learning just about anything. And because, like, in a remote setting, I can give, and I gave kids at the high school level, like music theory type exercises, and we did some rhythm type exercises. And when you're just kind of throwing out stuff to them where they're not able to see the connection to either something socially that they're experiencing or the greater learning experience, right? They're not motivated to do it. Right. And I don't think anybody would be, really, if they're just handed a task to do and told to do it. So I think realistically, obviously there are a lot of technical and administrative struggles in teaching remotely. But the one aspect of it that we still struggle with this when we're in person, but it's a little easier, is making sure that all of that knowledge, that the student experience is one where they understand why they're learning what they're learning. And I think that remote just made that even more difficult, because they're not connecting it to a social experience, which is a huge part of being a kid at whatever level, is learning through being with your friends and being in a social situation. But then just not really knowing where you're headed. COVID kind of, kids generally, I remember when I was in high school, even college, sometimes you're just like, I don't know what I'm doing today. You just have, and the younger they are, they're just kind of bopping along and doing whatever they want. But when COVID comes in, not even the adults know where you're going to be in a couple of days sometimes. And that's hard for a student. Why would you be motivated to learn something if you don't know what's going to happen? Like for example, there were a couple times when I had the potential for events for our high schoolers to perform at something come up, and then sometimes they'd be canceled just to upcoming or COVID situations that happened. So for them, it's like, why are we putting in all this work just to have things be canceled?
Yep.
So
I feel that.
That for me was probably the biggest struggle of the remote and COVID type situation. We as educators learn to be adaptive, pretty much every day. We're dealing with kids being pulled out of class, or scheduling conflicts, or a different type of differentiated things where we're having to teach different, like kids with stratified understanding of concepts, and all those things. We're adaptive in that way. But when we don't have a concrete like foundation to base ourselves off of, if something can shift and change our whole plans almost on a weekly basis, we're like fish out of water. We don't have any power anymore.
Now I will admit that it did have some advantages, but albeit they were maybe different than I expected. For instance, this year the kids got pretty good at checking their emails, which I didn't have email until I was in like 8th or 9th grade. So for these kids, they're all 10 and 11, and they're having to figure out email, but also like email etiquette. Like a lot of times you'll just get an email where the subject line is "Help! I don't know what to do," and there's like
best.
Yeah, and there's like no text in the body, and you're like, okay, but I mean that like they were able to check in with me and figure out, not every student, but a lot of them I felt like I had pretty good communication with. Also on Zoom, you can just share your screen and show them immediately whatever you'd like to see. Whereas in class, you pull it up on a projector, or the kids all have their own, and it takes a lot of time. But for me, I can have a tab ready to go, share my screen, musictheory.net. All right, we're doing note recognition today. Or I think my favorite unexpected thing from Zoom was when I started teaching my percussionists how to read like a multi-percussion part. Like, for instance, we were on the song we were doing, percussion 1 was snare, bass, or I think it was only one percussion part. So it was like snare, bass drum, suspended cymbal, and tambourine all on one page. And so we took a couple lessons to figure out how to actually read it. And all I did was share my screen, use the highlighter tool, and color coded it. And so we would play one color code, and then I'd erase it, and we'd play the same thing without the color there, and then we did it for the next one. And so I actually was like, I wish I could do this on a normal year, like, because that's something that's a little more difficult to erase it easy when it's just on a piece of paper. So it was always kind of nice whenever you do something and you're like, actually, Zoom made this easier,
Yeah, I think most educators would agree that the necessitated use of technology was a bonus, or not a bonus, but it's a positive from this experience, because like you said, there are some techniques that we had to develop that are definitely make information and the types of information that we need our students to see way more accessible to them.
Yeah.
I did something with a student I was giving a baritone lesson on in high school, where I projected a PDF of the piece she was studying, and she had her own piece, but I was able to, it's just like in an Adobe, editor, PDF editor.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And you're able to just take a marker that's on the screen and circle things and write things. And that way, the student is able to see it in a big format, and you can talk about it and you can work through it. And I thought it was a really, really effective way to study a piece of music. But you can, like you did something like that too, and you can do that with lots of other things, and you can do that in a large ensemble setting. And what I continually am thinking about with technology is there's always this debate of teachers that are not as technologically inclined, or teachers that are, and there's inherent issues with both of it, because when there's a lot of benefits that technology can bring to a classroom, but you can also become over reliant on it, and then when it's not there, you're a little bit stuck because you don't know how to use the kind of traditional skills of teaching to get yourself by. But what I always fall back on, and something that I think most people should keep in mind when they're attempting to either introduce more technology or develop new technological strategies in the classroom is that the technology is always serving the content or the effect of the lesson that you're trying to do, right? So it
Yeah.
shouldn't, the lesson should not be about learning how to use technology, or it shouldn't be about like, oh, that was a cool thing that we did on the computer today. The technology should just help students have access to the information easier,
Right.
because like, I'm sure everybody has experienced as a music teacher where you try to explain something to a student using some music terminology and they just don't get it. But as soon as you show it to them, it's like they instantly understand. That's what technology does. You can take a concept or a sound or something and immediately bring it to the level of the understanding of the student in a way that's easy for you and easy for the student.
Right. Yeah, so all in all, I am looking forward to a more normal year, yeah, especially just the social aspect of it, you know, getting back to music. And but like we just saying, you know, there's always something to learn. So
Yeah. So this going forward in the In Good Time podcast, we're looking to have some more guests on. We're looking to do some more conversations about kind of the same things we've been talking about, but maybe going deeper into some other things that aren't necessarily specifically educationally minded, but always with a connection back to the way that we approach music and the way that we teach our students. So we thank you for joining us once again on the In Good Time podcast, and we hope you all have a good day.